By 1974, the situation in Cyprus had been more tense than ever before. Just a decade and a half ago, the country had achieved its independence from the British Empire under some peculiar circumstances. Britain, Greece and Turkey would become guarantors of Cypriot independence, giving them the right to intervene in the country to restore order in case anything went wrong. Something that was ratified by the Treaty of Guarantee. Meanwhile, power would be shared between the Greek elected president Archbishop Makarios and the Turkish elected vice president Fazıl Küçük. For the Turks, such a compromise was crucial in securing their rights and autonomy from the majority Greek population, which at the time still made up around 78%. The Greek Cypriots, though, were not so happy with this arrangement, feeling that the Turkish population was overrepresented in the government. They felt as though this clear majority in the island should give them the rights to dictate the country's future and push for union with Greece in a movement known as Enosis. The Turks, quite understandably so, were not too keen in becoming minorities within a Greek-controlled Cyprus, and instead favored what is called a Taksim, a partition of the island between the two countries. Over the following years, various negotiation attempts would be made between Greece, Turkey and Britain to solve the Cypriot dispute, with most of them failing due to the reluctance of President Makarios to negotiate with Turkey. Seemingly, after Cyprus's independence, Makarios switched his stance and hoped to prevent Enosis, satisfied with the status quo. The reasoning behind this shift can mostly be pinned down to realpolitik and the wish of Makarios not to cause a war with Turkey. Regardless, attention would soon turn to Greece, as in April of 1967, some colonels led by Georgios Papadopoulos would overthrow the government and establish a military junta, a regime which overwhelmingly backed Enosis. As a result, despite not proclaiming complete independence, the Turks of Cyprus started to de facto act independently from the rest of the country. Violence amongst the two communities became common, while Greco-Turkish relations were at an all-time high. The climax of the standoff would come in 1973, where Greece had another coup led by Dimitris Ioannidis that removed Papadopoulos from power and installed a much harsher military regime on the nation. Now the government openly began to prepare for the full incorporation of Cyprus into Greece proper. As violence persisted and diplomatic solutions stalled, the Greek junta increasingly viewed direct intervention in Cyprus as the only way to achieve Enosis. The following year, the Cypriot National Guard, with the backing of Greece, successfully couped the country and deposed Makarios, installing Nikos Sampson as the new president. During this whole time, Turkey was not sitting idly by. Starting from 1959, they pretty much single-handedly prevent every single attempt at Enosis made by Greece, and now they were looking to do exactly that once more. The Turks attempted to get Britain on their side, but to no avail, and thus opted to invade Cyprus alone. Soon the first phase would begin, with Turkish forces landing in Kyrenia and capturing areas in the north of the country which housed sizable Turkish populations. The Greek junta was quick to respond, attempting to send in the army, though with limited success, as doing so could risk a full-scale war with Turkey. This invasion greatly damaged the reputation of Ioannidis' regime, which was already highly unpopular by that time, eventually leading to the full collapse of the government on July 24, 1974. Turning back to Cyprus, following a deadlock in peace negotiations, the second phase of the Turkish invasion would begin, resulting in the capture of some 37% of the island in favor of Turkey. At this point, the United Nations would enforce a demilitarized border zone running across the island, effectively dividing Cyprus into a Greek and a Turkish half. Greeks and Turks alike fled their respective homelands due to the growing persecution they began to suffer from the opposite side. At last, the government of Makarios Makarios was reinstated, while Greece returned to a democratic system shortly after. Even though the conflict had ended, Cyprus's division solidified. In the north, the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus was proclaimed in 1983, with the only state officially recognizing it being, of course, Turkey. Indeed, the situation around the island, even up till the present day, remains extremely tense, with a solution unlikely to be found in the near future. But despite the sheer tension between Greece and Turkey during the time, cooler heads prevailed in the end, and the conflict only remained a regional affair. However, this didn't have to happen. When Turkey sent forces to invade Cyprus, the leaders of the Greek junta met at the Pentagon with representatives of the US government. There, negotiations got heated, with the US denying Greece support if they declared war on Turkey. At the end, Ioannidis even stormed out of the room outraged, threatening to proceed with the war declaration anyways. Of course, as we know, he was bluffing, but that just goes to show how far things had gotten. So, it is then natural to wonder what if this had happened, and Greece officially entered to war with Turkey in 1974 over Cyprus. Well, before we even go into the scenario, it is important to know who the one declaring war even is. Since the both countries were NATO members, anyone declaring war would in theory trigger Article 5, an article which states that an attack against a member of the alliance is an attack against all. Though in practice, many questions would be raised whether this applies if the attack comes from a fellow NATO member, something that the alliance did not calculate for. Thus, in this video, I am going to explore two timelines, one where Greece declares war on Turkey and one where the opposite occurs. Let's begin with the scenario where Turkey is the one to declare war first. Historically, after the coup that took place in Cyprus in 1974, Nikos Sampson did not try to rush an OSCE with Greece, and instead initially focused on clearing the island from Makarios' supporters. To create a reason for Turkey to declare war, let's assume that Sampson is instead a bit more careless and declares union with Greece shortly after his ascension to power. Of course, the junta would accept and Cyprus would be officially folded into Greek proper. Such a move would be completely illegal according to the Treaty of Guarantee, and as such, Turkey would request support from Britain like in our timeline, something that would be rejected. Thus, the Turks would act alone, declaring war on Greece on July 20th, 1974. Immediately, NATO is in crisis mode. While in theory Turkey was the one to declare war on Greece, direct involvement from European powers or the US for that matter would be rather unlikely. In fact, most NATO countries are likely to side with Turkey instead, at least in the early stages of the war. As mentioned before, Greece was a military dictatorship, something quite unpopular amongst the democratic European powers. A declaration of unification between Greece and Cyprus might be seen as an attempt by the junta to aggressively expand their domains. Zooming in, given what has been mentioned thus far, the situation in Cyprus very much favors the Turks, which have no trouble wiping the floor with the unprepared Greek army. With a full war between the two powers, the UN may not even intervene to stop the Turkish advance, allowing the Turks to continue pushing the Greeks southwards, though with no intention of annexing the whole island. On the Greek mainland then, it is somewhat plausible that Turkey attempts an invasion of the country via Thrace, though if they do, then it is certainly going to fail. Despite the disaster in Cyprus in 1974, both countries were about evenly matched in all departments, with Turkey having just a slight edge. Thus, the Aegean and Thracian theatres would be hard fought, with very little progress from either side. A Turkish invasion of the Greek Aegean, for example, would be unfeasible, while a Greek landing in Izmir and a march to Istanbul are only nationalist pipe dreams. Airstrikes across the Aegean Mediterranean would become common as the both sides attempt to exhaust the other in the hopes of diverting attention from the main front, which is Cyprus. Despite it all, however, with Turkish forces threatening to completely kick out the Greeks from the island, support for Turkey would quickly deteriorate. Back in Greece, unrest due to the prolonged war would lead to the overthrow of the second Greek junta and the return to democracy for the nation. At this point, NATO is likely to step in and force a negotiated peace deal, as especially the US government would not want to see this conflict escalate further. But before we continue, this is your reminder to please not drink bleach. Doing so could have severe consequences to your body, and there is a small possibility that it causes a little something known as death. Avoiding this drink at all costs would be extremely beneficial, and your body will thank you for it. And while you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel if you're enjoying the content thus far. Anyways, let's get back with the video. The negotiations would mostly center around Cyprus, where an agreement would not be reached, as Turkey would refuse to leave any occupied territory. A UNDMZ is as a result formed in a similar fashion as our timeline, with Cyprus becoming independent once again, though remaining closely aligned with Greece. On the mainland then, very little territory would exchange hands, with maybe Greece gaining Gökçeada and Boscada, as to not feel like a completely defeated nation. In the north, the United Nations could possibly set up another demilitarized zone around the Embros River. The both parties are decently likely to agree to this in order to de-escalate tension. On the whole, this war would have been devastating, with tens of thousands of deaths, more than half of which being civilians. Following the direct armed conflict, a violent population exchange in Cyprus would most certainly happen in a similar way as it did historically. Greece would also drive the Turks living in Gökçeada and Boscada out and would flood the islands with new Greek settlers. The both countries have been irreversibly altered. In Turkey, a strong bitterness towards the NATO alliance would develop. Despite the Turks acting completely legally according to the Treaty of Guarantee, NATO decided to support a nation ruled by a military junta, and even scandalously forcing Turkey to give up some of its territory. This greatly diminishes any serious hope of Turkey's integration into the European order, as the two factions grow increasingly apart. This of course doesn't mean that Turkey suddenly leaves NATO and joins up with the Warsaw Pact or something. The country would still remain a strong NATO ally, their geographic position ensures that. But as the decades progress and the Cold War comes to a close, we can reasonably expect Turkey to start drifting away from NATO and pursuing new alliances. To add insult to injury, the economy post-war would greatly suffer, with inflation worsening, foreign investments greatly limited, and possible trade embargoes being enacted by other nations, though the last one is more unlikely. Pretty much everything outlined here also applies to Greece. Despite technically winning the war, the reality underground could have been any more different. For one, the country's primary goal in this conflict was defending and securing Cyprus, something which eventually fell flat. Instead of this war being limited to just Turkey and Cyprus, now it would be mostly Greece to blame for the catastrophe that has engulfed the island. The country also heavily relies on tourism to help fuel its economy, an industry which would have certainly taken a massive hit as a result of the war, especially if the country comes to be ruled by Andreas Papandreou in the latter half of the 1980s. We can more than reasonably expect the Greek economy to be even more backwards than it is in our timeline. line. In contrast to Turkey though, Greece would remain a strong NATO ally, as attempting to divert paths may leave room for the Turks to start another limited war, one which Greece is certainly not going to win this time around. Shifting our sights to the broader consequences of said conflict, and we notice a devastated NATO. A full-scale war between two members of the same alliance is not a good look, particularly of an alliance led by the United States. The Soviet Union could make use of this opportunity to propagandize the Greco-Turkish war as the inability of the United States to sustain lasting peace even amongst its allies. This obviously isn't going to prevent their collapse or anything, but post-Cold War many questions would be brought up as to what the point for NATO to exist even is. Greco-Turkish relations are to remain tense for the foreseeable future, with the shadow of war always looming in the background, though of course another conflict is in practice quite unlikely. But the scenario assumes that Turkey is the one to declare war. Let's shift back in time and discuss a scenario where Greece is the one to escalate the conflict instead. How this may happen is rather arbitrary. As mentioned like a million times before in this video, Greece was a military junta, with its leader Ioannidis not being the sanest individual. In fact, even Wikipedia describes him as a type of Greek Gaddafi, which just further proves my point. Imagining a world where Ioannidis just declares war on Turkey after they begin their campaign in Cyprus is not crazy. As a point of divergence, we could choose the high-level meetings in the Pentagon between the leaders of Greece and US representatives that I talked about at the start of the video. With negotiations reaching a deadlock, Ioannidis outright threatened to declare war on Turkey, exiting the room outraged. Now, I feel as it is important to mention, it is a bit unclear whether this actually happened, as the only source I found about this was this video by Greek YouTuber Practical Thinking. But for the sake of the scenario, I am going to take this claim at face value as it suits the occasion quite nicely. So, as Turkish forces land in Cyprus, Greece attempts to secure American support, which ultimately falls through. And as a result, the Greeks opt to proceed alone, declaring war on Turkey over the issue. In contrast to before, in this timeline NATO would overwhelmingly back the Turks, with even the United States, a traditional ally of Greece, seeing this war declaration as going too far. Once again, this doesn't mean that all of NATO now joins the war, beating back the Greeks and kicking them from the alliance. More likely than not, each state would be able to intervene to whatever extent they want, with most only sending limited aid to Turkey. The bulk of the fighting would most certainly revolve around Cyprus. Turkish forces would make a great headway into the north as Greece attempts to reinforce the south. The war would more or less mirror that of our own timeline, with few changes if Greece doesn't attempt anything stupid. However, knowing the higher ups of the military junta, and also to make the scenario more interesting, let's assume they do escalate the conflict, beginning plans for an invasion of Thrace. If such thing is indeed executed, then we can be sure it will fail. An operation across the Embros would be extremely risky, and the attacker always has an inherited disadvantage. Of course, similar to the previous scenario, as Turkish forces advance southwards into Cyprus, public opinion would eventually shift over to the side of Greece. The war would still rage on, as Turkey would now take the initiative. Several battles would be fought in the Aegean, with most of them having no direct winner. Meanwhile, inside of Greece, this war would prove to be extremely unpopular, and, combined with the already strong dislike for the junta, the government would collapse and the return of democracy would be finalized. During the chaos, I consider it possible, though somewhat unlikely, that Turkey moves to occupy some Greek islands, though ultimately being stopped from making major gains, due to steep American pressure. Ultimately, hoping to prevent more advances and frankly frankly wanting the war over, the US would force the both parties to negotiate a peace deal. Pretty much the end result is going to be almost identical to the previous scenario, only with one major caveat. Turkey refuses to leave the islands they've occupied. This has quite a few important ramifications for the future. In Greece, this war would be seen as a massive betrayal by NATO, which supported Turkey and supposedly handed them territory for free, even though that's not how things played out in reality. Counterintuitively, this may push the country much closer to NATO, instead of having the opposite effect. As outlined in the previous scenario, Greece attempting to leave NATO would basically be signing its own death warrant, as without the alliance structure guaranteeing Greek defense, Turkey would have no problem starting a second war and taking over the Aegean completely. Still, it is reasonable to expect a lot of unrest as a result of the treatment of Greece during this conflict, only further hurting relations between the two camps. But as Greece is suffering, Turkey is quietly clapping their hands. Not only have they managed to secure northern Cyprus, but they have also expanded their territory massively into the Aegean. Conversely, not all is on a map. Turkey post-war would become something like a pariah state, with sanctions and trade embargoes more than likely being placed on the nation. Because of this, Turkey may start ignoring orders from NATO, possibly even exiting its military structure, though this is not something I can see the US of ever accepting. Relations with Greece would be even more tense than in the previous scenario, as the Greeks would have ambitions to reclaim their lost territory while the Turks hope for complete domination over the Aegean. Indeed, the main takeaway of both of these scenarios is that both countries are significantly weaker and a lot poorer than they were historically. Hostilities amongst the two would continue to persist even well into the 21st century, at which point things become impossible to predict due to the lack of foresight as we enter the modern day. But with that, I am going to end the scenario here. If you enjoyed the content, please leave a like, subscribe and comment below what you thought of the video. And as always, don't forget to join the Discord linked in the description below. Anyways, that's all, Todd Zines, and happy Christmas and a Merry New Year to all of you watching this video. Goodbye.